IT was a typical gray day in Buenos Aires, and despite being retired, I still felt the unmistakable urge of curiosity that had accompanied me throughout my career. When I was called to review the case of Mr. Alberto Marquez, a 78-year-old man found dead in his apartment in the San Telmo neighborhood, I thought it would be a quiet procedure, just another formality to close quickly. His death seemed natural, with no obvious signs of violence or struggle, and the neighbors mentioned that they hadn't seen him leave or answer the phone for days. Upon arriving, the scene seemed clear to me, almost boring for a forensic expert. The body was in a natural position, without advanced rigor mortis. The room tidy, with no traces or disorder suggesting anything unusual. Everything seemed to fit with a cardiac arrest or some sudden event that no one could do anything about. However, out of habit, I walked calmly through the room, observing every detail, as if the objects themselves could speak to me. I looked at the bedside table, the pages of the half-open book, the half-empty cup of tea, and the clock showing 9:17. This matched the preliminary account of the doorman, who had heard a slight noise that morning. A common picture, a story of solitary death like so many others. But while inspecting the floor near the door, something caught my attention. A tiny, almost imperceptible footprint that seemed to have been overlooked by everyone present. It was not a common mark like those from a shoe or usual dirt, but a faint impression, like a careless gesture, a fleeting contact. At first, I hesitated because, after many years of experience, one learns not to overinterpret relevant signs. However, that footprint did not match Mr. Marquez's, nor those of the personnel who had entered earlier. It was small, almost childlike, and seemed to come from an object someone had shifted. My instinct urged me to follow it. Very carefully, I began collecting evidence around the floor, marking the position of each piece of paper, inspecting rugs and furniture with a magnifying glass. The footprint was on the edge of a rug, where it seemed someone had unintentionally dragged something. This was the first tangible indication that perhaps I was not facing such a simple death. I then remembered that forensic science is not only about corpses, but also about everything surrounding the place. Every little detail, even if it seems irrelevant, is part of a bigger story. While the team of experts photographed the scene, I decided to check the building's security footage. It took a while, but when we retrieved it, I found something peculiar. Around 8:45 in the morning, a figure wearing a dark coat entered the building. The face was not clearly visible, but they carried a large bag and moved discreetly, walking just fast enough not to attract attention. The entry had been recorded by the doorman, but he did not remember the visit, so no one had paid it much mind. Right then, I thought the footprint I found might belong to that person. My heart began to beat a little faster. That small detail was changing the entire panorama. What if that man hadn't died alone? What if someone else had been with him? I couldn't stop thinking about it because it reminded me of so many stories I had encountered throughout my working life. Deaths that, at first glance, seemed natural but had secrets buried beneath everyday silence. I returned to the scene, and this time noticed a small corner of the room where some wilted flowers lay inside an old vase. Nearby, on a desk, there was an unopened package that no one had mentioned. The package had a label with Mr. Marquez's name and address, but was partially covered by a document that seemed to have been hastily handled. I opened it carefully and found a letter. I didn't read it immediately because I felt I had to gather all the pieces first. However, I kept the envelope cautiously, sensing it might hold a key. While sharing my initial findings with the team, one of the young experts came in with his notes. He told me they had found a faint stain on the rug near where the footprint was. It was a substance resembling blood, but in a darker, dried shade, almost as if it were old. That confirmed someone else had been at the scene, someone who might have tried to clean or hide something. At that moment, something inside me was triggered. I felt that same adrenaline from those years, when every case confronted me with uncertainty and mystery. I couldn't let this death be like so many others forgotten. I thought of Mr. Marquez's family, of the loneliness that often weighs more than a physical wound, and of my responsibility as a forensic doctor to seek the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. That's how I decided to delve deeper into Alberto's life. I gathered information from his neighbors, his general practitioners, building employees, and even some acquaintances I managed to contact. He had lived alone for years, his wife had passed away long ago, and his children, living abroad, only kept in touch by phone occasionally. He had no apparent enemies, but did have some financial problems and a recent history of arguments with a man claiming to be a debt collector. This last clue lit a stronger light in the investigation. Could that individual be the visitor caught on the recordings? Did he have something to do with the footprint and the stain we found on the rug? I then decided to trace that profile based on the cameras and police records we had access to. Days later, a set of testimonies and a more detailed search yielded results. We found a man with a criminal record for minor offenses and an old debt owed to Mr. Marquez, something the elderly man had kept himself. This man admitted having gone to collect the debt, but claimed he had never entered the apartment, that he only stayed at the door and left a message for payment. However, those explanations did not align with the physical evidence I had found. The footprint, the stain, the cameras confirming entry into the building. Moreover, there were the documents in the letter which, after deeper analysis, contained phrases showing fear and pressure from Mr. Marquez. Every little detail seemed to assemble a disturbing puzzle. It was not just a simple debt collection. There was a hidden story behind that quiet death that no one wanted to see. Days passed and something new appeared. Upon reviewing the autopsy, I detected a small wound, almost imperceptible, on one of the fingers of the right hand. A scratch that might not have been considered significant, but could result from a slight struggle. Meticulous as I am, I requested that the house be searched for more biological evidence, especially at the front door. There, they found traces of another print, this time on the wood, which partially matched the one we found inside. At that moment, I realized that to move forward, I needed the help of criminologists expert in footprint analysis. Working together, we identified that the footprint belonged to a woman. This was an unexpected turn. The person who had entered and touched key surfaces in the apartment, leaving hard-to-see traces, was not the debt collector but someone else. Someone with a different relationship to the elderly man. This discovery led me to consider the hypothesis of a close visit. Searching through records and statements, we found an old friend of Mr. Marquez, a woman who had been in contact with him weeks earlier. She had reasons to visit the apartment and hidden motives for not making it public. When I finally interviewed her, she gave me a much more complex version. She spoke of resentments, hidden secrets, and a final meeting that didn't go as expected. The woman recounted that during an argument, the man had an accidental fall in which she tried to help him, but the situation ended in a result she herself couldn't clearly explain. This testimony, as confusing as it was, matched the evidence I had. The tiny footprint that no one had noticed was hers. The dark stain, a small wound insignificant to her, but fatal in its effect. And the scratch on the finger, a sign of that accident. Everything was connected in a narrative that time and indifference had almost erased. I never cease to be amazed at how, despite all the technology and advances in science, it is often the small signs, those that seem insignificant, that lead us to uncover profound truths. At that moment, I remembered why I dedicated so many years to this profession. Patience, calm, and an attentive eye can completely change the fate of an investigation. Mr. Marquez's case left me with an indelible lesson. No matter how many times we think we've seen it all, there will always be an invisible trace that forces us to stop, think, and look beyond the obvious. And in that search, we discover not only answers about death, but also about the fragility and complexity of life itself. While the woman recounted that last morning, her words trembled between memories and regrets, as if she were reliving every moment over and over again without being able to undo what had happened. She said she found Mr. Marquez visibly upset, with a mix of fear and hopelessness that she did not expect in a man accustomed to solitude and routine. According to her account, the argument was nothing more than the eruption of old grudges, wounds from the past that she thought had been overcome, but that day seemed to awaken with unusual force. She told me that, while trying to calm him down, an accidental shove made him lose his balance and fall backward, hitting his head against the edge of a piece of furniture. She tried to help him quickly, but the tension controlled every gesture, and amidst confusion, the elderly man lost consciousness. It was a scene of panic and bewilderment, a mixture of fear and guilt that explained why she had not called anyone or sought help. Her voice broke as she admitted she had tried to clean the scene a little, not knowing that every gesture, every half-wiped stain, was another mark against her. Her words made everything we had done until that moment take on a different dimension. The tiny fingerprint, the dark stain, the letter with urgent messages, and the small but strategic wound on Alberto's finger now made sense within a human, imperfect, and painful narrative. It was a story not only of a death, but a life marked by loneliness, fear, and despair. In the following days, as the case progressed through judicial investigation, I continued calmly reviewing every piece of evidence, absorbing tiny details that most would overlook. The story became tangled in layers that were just beginning to reveal their complexity. We found, for example, a receipt forgotten in the desk drawer which closed a financial relationship between Alberto and a medical services company with which he had some accumulated debt. There was another door there, another possible reason for that agitated state, an economic pressure that, combined with the woman's unexpected visit and the tension with the collector, wove a complicated web. That mix of external pressures and internal conflicts reminded me how heavy social isolation weighs on a person's life. Alberto, like many elderly people, seemed trapped in a cycle of abandonment reflected in that silent and tidy apartment. There were no signs of excessive violence, nor blatant attempts to conceal the body, only small traces, tiny footprints like the one I found in the beginning, that told a much more complex story. That made me think about how many times justice acts on accidents disguised as guilt or negligence, without understanding the emotional layers beneath. One day, while reviewing the building's recordings again, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed, a subtle movement near the hallway, as if someone had been watching from a distance. In a shadow almost invisible to the eye. It was impossible to know who, but the feeling of being watched gave a new air to the investigation. I decided to share this finding with the team, who in turn suggested checking other cameras near the building in search of any signal that might be relevant. What followed was a patient and meticulous task of hours in front of screens, reviewing seconds, analyzing gestures, try to find a face, a car, a movement that could explain activity in those days before the death. Finally, a sequence appeared that seemed minimal but changed the perception of the case. A figure quickly approaching the building, looking back several times, as if being followed or fleeing from something. It was neither the woman nor the collector, but someone else, someone whose presence had not been detected in the first reviews. Their face remained out of focus, but their behavior betrayed nervousness and worry. This new element opened an unexpected question. What role did that mysterious person play in Alberto Marquez's story? Had they visited the building, or were they simply passing nearby? The possibility that more than one visitor had been involved during those hours alerted everyone, as it pointed to a chain of causes and consequences that went beyond the simple accident hypothesis. That night, recalling old practices from my career, I decided to do something that nowadays might seem obsolete. Go to the place, walk the surrounding streets, feel the atmosphere, talk to neighbors who perhaps had not yet been interviewed. The San Telmo neighborhood, with its mix of history and modernity, offered details with lives of their own, voices that at first seemed insignificant but could give meaning to those barely hinted passages. I spoke with a shopkeeper who remembered Mr. Marquez for his daily purchases, with a doorman from another building who mentioned having seen a strange man lurking several days before. I gathered testimonies that spoke of growing conflict, not only with the woman or the collector, but with a person from Mr. Marquez's past, someone with whom he had an unresolved old dispute. The next day at the forensic office, we reviewed the documents Alberto had accumulated on his desk. We found letters, promissory notes, even marginal notes in books, handwritten with a firm but sometimes trembling hand. In those lines, we discovered warning messages, calls for caution, words that showed palpable tension. There were clear signs of subtle persecution, of someone who did not just want to collect a debt, but sought something more intangible, control, power, or revenge. As we assembled the puzzle, I felt we were approaching not only the truth of Alberto's last day, but a larger web, a legacy of conflicts and silences he was part of. Forensic science, with its advanced techniques, allowed us to analyze every stain, every footprint, every written word. But the humanity behind those data showed us an emotional landscape of pain filled with shadows and secrets. One early morning, while reviewing samples collected at the scene, I discovered something even more surprising. Under the carpet, hidden in an almost invisible fold, we found a piece of fabric with fibers that did not match Mr. Marquez's known clothing nor the woman's clothes who confessed to being in his apartment. This suggested the presence of a third party, someone whose identity remained a mystery, but who had been close enough to leave those traces hidden in plain sight. With this new evidence, the pressure to move forward grew. I called fiber analysis specialists, who with their microscopes managed to identify the type of fabric and the composition of those fibers. It was no minor detail because it allowed us to narrow down suspect lists and establish matches with garments seized during the investigation. The possibility of discovering that person pushed us not to give up. Meanwhile, interviews and confrontations with the main actors in the case increased the tension. The woman who had been with Alberto changed her version several times while telling her story, showing a mix of fear and confusion. Her attitude seemed to say she was afraid of something or someone, as if she were under broader pressure. That ambiguity raised all kinds of questions in me and the team. To what extent was the truth we were seeking complete? How many layers of silence and fear did we have to go through to get to the bottom? At those moments, I knew I had to remain calm, avoid jumping conclusions, and keep studying the pieces patiently. Patience, that silent companion who had guided me many times in past years, allowed me to organize the facts, give meaning to the fragmented story, and find, in that slow generation of certainty, the key to explaining the outcome. Sometimes I think forensic science is an art discerning among shadows. It is not enough to expect the truth to show itself clearly and sharply. Rather, one must be able to see between the lines, interpret subtle gestures, listen to what is not said. The tiny footprint that made me stop that first morning was just the opening to a dark and complicated world, where death is only the last chapter of a story involving fear, loneliness, hidden violence, and a struggle for justice that transcends the legal. Now, every time I leave a case behind, I know I carry with me not only data, results, or reports, but also the silent testimony of those who can no longer speak. And it is that burden, that invisible responsibility, that reminds me why I never stop being a forensic scientist in spirit, even if the uniform no longer fits me. Because deep down, every trace, no matter how small, contains the echo of a life worth hearing, a truth that must be revealed. Mr. Alberto Marquez's case confirmed to me that death is not the end nor the break, but the link to a story that we must care for, respect, and understand. And in that responsibility act patience, attention to detail, and the conviction that, when seeking the truth, we honor those left behind, with their silences and hidden traces waiting to be discovered. Time taught me that in forensics, justice and humanity always walk hand in hand, under the same slow but firm step. That early morning, while the city slept and silence seemed to have taken over every corner, I clung to that small sample hidden under the rug, a simple fragment of fabric that had become the most important piece of the entire puzzle. I knew that behind that detail, insignificant to many, there was a story crying out to be discovered. What might have seemed a coincidence to others was, for me, a valuable clue, the confirmed suspicion that we had not seen even half of what had really been woven in that apartment. The following hours in the lab were a mix of anxiety and restrained hope. The analysis team, accustomed to dealing with microscopic evidence, described the texture and composition of the fabric with a meticulousness that seemed slow, but in reality, each discovery brought us a little closer to unraveling a truth that remained hidden. We knew it did not belong to Mr. Marquez's clothes, nor to those of the woman who had declared she had been in the apartment, which meant only one thing. There was a third party involved. Someone who, until that moment, had stayed in the shadows like an invisible ghost. The next day at the office, the feeling of having discovered the tip of an iceberg grew with every document we reviewed. It wasn't just a physical trace, but also the shadows that fabric raised, a ghost that seemed to whisper in every letter, in every silence accompanying the case. The forgotten receipt, the letters with words tinged with warning, the nervous figure in the recordings, and now an invisible witness leaving behind tangible proof. All of this formed a much more complex web, in which Alberto Marquez's death might only be the visible consequence of a much larger conflict. We went back to study the recordings carefully, hoping that perhaps that mysterious person had been captured closer at some fleeting moment, from some unexpected angle. Every camera, every second, was an ocean of possibilities where we had to find the needle that would reveal the hidden face. It was then that a blurry, almost imperceptible image appeared. A man who seemed to nervously look toward the building entrance, not crossing the door, but gesturing as if speaking in secret or waiting for someone. His posture was tense, his movements quick, fast, and elusive. It was unclear whether he noticed he was being recorded, but his behavior suggested fear, haste, and a secret he wanted to keep at all costs. That instant, so fleeting and barely visible, unleashed a cascade of unanswered questions. Who was he? Why was he afraid? Was he someone connected to Alberto, or just a stranger unrelated to the story? I felt we were facing a turning point. If we could identify that man, maybe we could reveal the shadows covering the real motive of the conflict. But the face remained blurry, a slippery silhouette in the darkness, an enigma wrapped in the urgency of a silent escape. I then decided to focus my efforts on the testimonies, those scattered voices from a neighborhood that, with more or less awareness, could have valuable information. The night in San Telmo had left me with the feeling that, despite the apparent calm, the environment preserved echoes of buried secrets. I repeated my visits, this time with a clearer plan, to seek not only direct accounts, but also those fragments of conversation, furtive glances, restrained gestures. Every neighbor, every shopkeeper, was part of a larger mosaic that could give us a real and tangible clue to move forward. One of those interviewed was an older man who worked at a hardware store a few blocks from the apartment. With a slow voice, interrupted by years of routine, he mentioned regularly seeing an individual who didn't seem from the neighborhood, who always wore a dark jacket and hat, and who prowled the area with a disturbing attitude. He never talked to anyone, but he was always watching, like he was waiting for something or someone, he said, although his account seemed anecdotal. For us, it became a pattern that fit the vague figure from the recording, and that repetition turned the anecdote into a solid lead. Meanwhile, at the office, the woman who had been with Alberto returned periodically, increasingly nervous and contradictory. Her versions changed subtly, and although she seemed remorseful, there was a fear in her eyes that went beyond personal guilt. I realized she not only distrusted us, but was a prey to a greater pressure. That added tension multiplied the case's complexity and made me suspect that the whole truth was being hidden not by her own will, but out of fear of possible consequences. After days of analysis and reconstruction, I faced the harsh reality that the case was no longer a simple domestic accident. We were facing a web of relationships and secrets where justice was trapped in a much darker game. I noticed how, as I delved into every detail, the plot grew more intricate and at the same time more fascinating. It was inevitable to think about the unseen lives behind the cold evidence, those private moments that only death allows us to explore with such slowness and care. In one of those moments of deep concentration, the forensic team handed me a preliminary report on the fabric analysis. It turned out to be a synthetic material, quite common in sportswear, with high resistance to wear. Nothing too specific at first glance, but the real surprise came later. Cross-referencing data, we discovered that in one of the building's consortium storage rooms, a similar garment had been seized some time earlier, linked to a local known in the neighborhood with a record for minor offenses, someone who had been reported to the local police for harassment, and who had also been seen near Alberto's apartment in the days before his death. This unexpected connection opened a new front to investigate. It wasn't the woman, it wasn't the collector, but here was a new player, someone who seemed to have a more hidden presence, whose relationship with Alberto we still had to determine. We knew that looking for him would be a challenge. He was a slippery figure, a name on the list that seemed unwilling to appear on stage, an urban ghost. Later that night, as I reviewed everything that happened, I recalled an old principle that had always marked my forensic practice. Silence also speaks, and it is not always comfortable to hear. Those blank spaces and statements, absences in security footage, barely perceptible evidence, all were expressions of that silence. Understanding that message was as important as analyzing blood or fibers. That revelation, subtle but profound, taught me that justice must move forward not only with clear and visible facts, but also with the intuition of what hides behind the gaps. The next morning, I decided to call the team for a meeting. I wanted to share the impression that each piece, beyond its scientific context, showed me, We were facing a story of fear, control, shadows that reached beyond the death of one man. Alberto Marquez was a starting point, a victim not only of a fatal accident, but of a web of tension where emotional wounds weighed much more than physical ones. I wanted everyone to understand the need not to rush, to advance patiently, because that silent truth needed time to emerge in all its dimension. A few days later, unexpected news arrived. The police had located the man linked to the seized garment. They had found him hiding in a peripheral neighborhood, nervous and unwilling to talk. The interrogation was long and tense. He did not deny being near the apartment, but assured that his presence was not directly related to Alberto's death, but to a personal mystery, an old unresolved matter that had led him to seek answers in that place. He said he had known Alberto for years, but denied any recent conflict, expressing a palpable fear of others who were more interested in silencing truths than revealing them. That statement added a new layer to the general thought. What stories do the silent inhabitants of that area hold? What conflicts do the building's walls and hallways preserve? Little by little, I understood that the case was far from being just an accident, and that Alberto Marquez's death had uncovered a larger plot, a hidden struggle involving not just people but also memories, secrets, and unresolved wounds. As I reflected on all this, I felt the role of a forensic expert transcended science. It's not enough to collect evidence or issue a report. Something is also asked of those of us who tell these stories. To keep memory alive, to honor silenced voices, to understand that behind every case there is a life and a network of human connections that cannot be reduced to mere data. Looking back now, as the judicial process advanced and some pieces began to fit together, I thought of that footprint no one had noticed. That small sign that demanded patience and attention, that invited us to look with different eyes, not to rush conclusions. That mark was the door discovering that death, although definitive, is always just part of a much broader story. That is why every time I leave a case behind, I carry with me the certainty that science and humanity must walk together, and that true justice is born from time and dedication to listen even to the faintest echo. And so the story continues, like an open book that is just beginning to be revealed page by page, a constant reminder that in life, as in death, nothing is simple, and that sometimes the most powerful truth lies in the smallest traces that, with patience, we managed to find as the investigation progressed. Each new revelation seemed to entangle us even more in a labyrinth of suspicions and half-truths. The figure of the man linked to the synthetic fabric appeared and disappeared like a slippery shadow, and with it, a growing feeling that we were in the midst of something much bigger and more dangerous than any police file could reflect. That invisible fear, which I had found in the nervous gaze of the woman and in the elusive silence of a mysterious visitor, was gradually materializing into a human web where the pieces only fit when we saw the complete picture, and even then, there were unexplained cracks. Days passed, and the pressure on the team increased. I felt how patience, that old virtue always upheld by forensic experts, began to waver under the need for clear answers. But I had learned that forcing the investigation too early only worsens the situation. It was better to move slowly as long as it was accompanied by precision. So, despite the anxiety that plagued us, we continued scrutinizing documents, cross-checking testimonies, and repeatedly reviewing that blurry video that seemed to hide more secrets than it revealed. Meanwhile, the man captured in the recordings remained a mystery. His face was barely a blur of pixels, but his gestures spoke more eloquently than many words. One small detail caught my strong attention. In the footage, it's seen how that individual carries an object in his hand that didn't fit the normality of the moment. It wasn't anything excessively large or ostentatious. It looked like a small package, wrapped carefully, almost as if he didn't want anyone to know what was hidden inside. That discretion, so evident, increased my suspicions that there was an exchange or intention that went far beyond mere surveillance or casual presence. Convinced that image was crucial, I decided to use graphic enhancement technology to try to clarify that blurry face, although I knew the limitations of the equipment and the camera quality would be an obstacle. However, when I returned to the lab the next morning, I was pleasantly surprised by the work done by the forensic imaging specialists. Although we didn't achieve perfect definition, certain facial features began to emerge with more clarity. It was no ordinary face. Thick eyebrows, a strong jawline, and a slight scar on the right cheek suggested someone with a marked past, someone who might have reasons to hide. The most interesting thing was comparing that image with the local database, where two partial matches appeared, names that until then had not figured among the main suspects. One of those matches corresponded to a man with minor police records, related to low-profile crimes and known for being part of the neighborhood's marginal environment. The other, however, was a less recognizable character, but with verifiable ties to one of the apartment complex's owners, someone who had managed several properties in the area and whose reputation oscillated between respect and fear. This unexpected discovery reminded us that neighborhood stories often have deep roots, complex combinations of interests and resentments, and often secrets hidden behind money or power. Then we received an even more unsettling twist. During a new round of interviews, a rarely participative neighbor, a middle-aged man with a simple appearance, dared to confess something he had been keeping silent about out of fear or ignorance. He had heard heated arguments and veiled threats between Alberto Marquez and a third party, someone whose name he could not place, but who seemed to exert some kind of control over the old man. That person instilled fear, but also, according to the neighbor's account, there was a veiled promise, a silent pact that kept Alberto in constant tension. The comment, seemingly randomly dropped in conversation, had the effect of a fragmentation bomb. If those words were accurate, then Mr. Marquez's death could be more than a tragic coincidence. We found it necessary to reconstruct Alberto's routine in greater detail in the days prior, searching for any sign of external pressure or recent conflicts. There was something about that home and his environment that didn't fit the initially painted picture, that of an old man who was simply the victim of a fatal accident. A meticulous review of his phone calls revealed a strange pattern. Many short communications, almost coded, with unregistered numbers and brief messages that, given the right information, could be interpreted as cries for help or warning signals. Upon investigating further, we tracked a series of messages mentioning words like control, silence, and debts, terms that usually do not appear in the simple context of an elderly person without apparent conflicts. The background began to unravel like a fabric full of uncertainties. Alberto was not only entangled with that man from the neighborhood, but also seemed trapped in a web of economic pressures and veiled threats that, combined with a condition, created an explosive cocktail. Although there was still much to understand to see the complete picture, we had reached a point where the investigation had to widen its focus beyond the apartment and the deceased man. It was necessary to understand the human connections, the implicit fears, the motivations hidden behind each silence. All this brought me back to the essential value I repeated throughout my career. Forensic science is useful, but it cannot solve a case without understanding the emotional and social climate that surrounds it. Fibers, videos, and photographs are just tools. What truly gives meaning to justice is the ability to listen, to assemble complicated puzzles with pieces that are not always evident at first glance. That is why that continuous discomfort, that narrative thread that led us to untold stories, was the engine driving progress, even if slow and fraught with obstacles. A new factor that accelerated the pace of the investigation was the sudden silence of the woman who had lived with Alberto in his final days. She, increasingly nervous, disappeared without warning, leaving no trace, and hypotheses began to arise about her possible state of fear or external pressure. This rekindled the idea that we were not dealing with random events, but with forces that had managed to silence many voices. It was not just a police matter. It was a scenario where the shadow of fear conditioned the truth, limited access to justice, and tested our resolve. At that stage, a new setback came from the police. The individual linked to the synthetic garment, the man from a neighborhood with a record, was quickly released due to lack of conclusive evidence. His testimony, more confusing than clarifying, added more questions than answers. He claimed his presence near the building was purely circumstantial, but it was impossible to deny that his contained and erratic movements showed some kind of involvement. A ghost who preferred to remain in the shadows to protect himself, but was also unwilling to cooperate. That elusive attitude increased the feeling that the truth was resisting, and that to reach it, we needed to play a game of patience and persuasion. It was then that we decided to explore another angle. That synthetic garment pointed not only to a man, but to a system. We thought perhaps we were facing a web where more people, maybe even officials or employees of the building, might be involved in maintaining that silence. The discovery of that fabric forced us to expand the field of search, to set aside prejudices, and to accept the complexity of the human and social aspects, especially in a neighborhood like San Telmo, where the historic and contemporary intersect, where each person carried their own load of secrets and silences. One morning, without warning, I received an unexpected message, an anonymous call proposing a meeting to reveal key information about Alberto's death. At that moment, I was filled with a mix of hope and mistrust. I knew anyone could try to deceive us, but also that sometimes the truth arrives in the form of whispers and clandestine encounters. We held a meeting in a discreet cafe, where a female voice, trembling and marked by fear, recounted fragments that seemed to fit the puzzle we were assembling. She revealed that Alberto had been trying to break free from a toxic bond, confronting those who wanted to silence him completely. That garment probably belonged to someone who wanted to intimidate him, but did not achieve the intended result. That confession, although incomplete, opened a powerful window into a conflict much more human and painful than we had imagined. In all those stories, in every fiber of evidence, in every observed shadow, I felt the case become a mirror reflecting not only the death of man, but also the struggle against fear, oppression, and oblivion. Contemplating that reality reaffirmed for me that justice, to be genuine, needs time, attention, and empathy. It is not enough to describe death. It is necessary to honor the stories of those who live and fight around it. And as night fell over Buenos Aires, allowing its faint lights to pass through the windows of the apartment where it all began, I understood that every thread that appeared in this plot was not just forensic evidence. It was the voice of a neighborhood, of a life, of a man who, although no longer with us, continued to speak through those marks that only patience and dedication allowed us to hear. Because science can point to where the body hurt, but it is humanity that discovers why the soul ached. And in that balance lies, perhaps, the deepest truth of all. What came next was a mix of bewilderment and revelations that seemed to slowly pull us away from the surface and immerse us in a much murkier and more complicated terrain. The woman who provided us with that information never appeared again, and although we tried to contact her by every means at our disposal, she had vanished. Just a few of her words had been enough to open a breach in the wall of silence surrounding the case, but they also left us with a disturbing patch of unanswered questions. We then focused on repeating the investigation from another angle. Alberto's daily movements in those last days and his unrecorded interactions. That synthetic garment, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, seemed like a symbol, a tangible reminder that someone had wanted to send a message. But what message? Who was behind it and why? One afternoon in the lab, as I reviewed the details, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed until then. An almost invisible stain on the edge of that garment. A stain so small and faint that its presence could only be confirmed using a specific reagent, one we usually employ to detect traces of substances like iron oxide or even certain chemicals that could indicate contact with weapons or industrial products. Without fanfare, I decided to run that test. I knew it wouldn't be a decisive finding, but in a case like this, where silence and shadows rule, even the smallest sign could become a key. The results confirmed an unexpected presence, a minute residue of a chemical compound commonly used in welding or metallurgical work. A curious detail that led us to explore Alberto's connection with that kind of environment. According to the investigation, although the man had been retired for years, he had maintained frequent contact with a nearby workshop, a humble place, but influential in the neighborhood's dynamics. The owner of that workshop became someone to understand carefully. He told us that Alberto, in his final days, had done several repairs on his bicycle, perhaps trying to stay active or looking for an excuse to go out, but he also admitted that certain people who frequented that workshop were not so easy to classify. Digging deeper, our intuitions met an even more inexplicable fact. Among the regular customers was a worker who, according to official records, had been missing for months. His name had fallen into oblivion, lost among other minor cases, but it turned out that man had a direct connection with the sphere of influence of that individual in the blurry video, the same one who wore the synthetic garment. The possibility that this figure was involved, either as a victim or as part of the network manipulating Alberto, added a layer of tragedy that went beyond the personal and touched darker aspects of life in the neighborhood. Moreover, The workshop seemed to be a node from which information and objects moved in ways we couldn't fully understand at the time. Fleeting contacts that pivoted between help and extortion. Subtle gestures that could pass as daily routine, but that, under a watchful eye, revealed a strange system of power rooted in fear and manipulation. I realized then that Alberto's environment was not just a passive setting. It was an active part of the complexity where fear, silence, and perhaps a subtle game of revenge or unsettled debts converged. As we tried to arrange these pieces, a new twist momentarily paralyzed us. An anonymous package had arrived at the laboratory, with no sender, just a small box containing fabric fragments similar to that synthetic garment, but also an envelope with photographs. These were no ordinary images. They showed scenes taken from a distance, almost as if someone had been watching, accumulating material for an unknown purpose. Alberto appeared in those photos, but also other characters who until then had been only names or vague faces in our notes. It seemed they brought to life a network woven in the shadows of San Telmo, a fabric of hidden relationships and behaviors we had begun to uncover. The presence of that package forced us to reconsider the security of our investigation. If someone was sending evidence secretly, it indicated they did not want to be discovered, and that perhaps we were getting too close to a dangerous core. The feeling of being watched became more palpable, and I soon noticed a mix of unease and motivation within the team, as if there was a key moment to unravel the mystery that had consumed us for so many weeks. From that moment on, the pieces began to fit together with a firmer, though painful, rhythm. We understood that Alberto, a man who appeared to lead a quiet, retired life, was trapped in a hidden dispute related to an outstanding debt that went beyond money, touching integrity, loyalties, and truly intimidating threats. The synthetic garment revealed itself as an insignia, a mark identifying a group, perhaps a marginal collective, perhaps a gang, that sought to control the building and its surroundings through intimidation and silencing. One of the key witnesses, who initially refused to testify, finally agreed to provide details in confidence. Carefully and always glancing sideways, this man revealed that Alberto had received explicit warnings not to interfere with certain illegal operations that involved everything from small smuggling to direct threats against those who wanted to report or leave that network. The last argument captured by the neighbor in the adjoining apartment had not been a simple altercation. It was clear evidence of the threat we now understood more clearly. Alberto had tried to resist, perhaps seeking justice or simply a break for his life, but that struggle ended up being more dangerous than we had imagined. As I saw all this reflected in the tired faces of the agents and in the accumulation of evidence, I realized the investigation was navigating terrain where the boundaries between victim and aggressor became less clear. The figure we sought, the man with the scar, the one wearing that garment with the almost imperceptible stain, was not just a suspect, but a cog in a chain of complex relationships fueled by precariousness and fear. And there, right in that tangle, lay the explanation for the trace no one had noticed at first. Interestingly, that small fragment of synthetic fabric drew from the past, steeped in family and neighborhood history, an emblem of a group that operated under unwritten but firm rules and had imposed a law silently over Alberto's surroundings without many noticing. That understanding forced us to change strategy. It was not just about material evidence, but about rebuilding trust in a community seemingly dominated by fear. We made attempt to protect neighbors willing to speak and try to weave a support network, but the resistance was enormous. Threats were palpable in their silences, in their restless movements, and even in the way they avoided eye contact. This social tension multiplied the technical difficulty of the case, reminding us that our work went far beyond the microscope and the crime scene. It was also a human management task, a fight against the invisibility imposed by fear. As the investigation stretched over time, the team and I owed an even greater commitment to bring to light not only the truth of Alberto's death, but also the conditions that led him to that fate. Understanding this web of oppression and silent violence was perhaps the deepest lesson I take from this case. It was a tangible reminder that justice cannot be only technical. It must also be accompaniment, understanding, courage to uphold the truth even amid fear. However, just when it seemed we were about to close the circle, something unexpected arose. A complimentary forensic report provided by one of my colleagues revealed a crucial detail. The direct cause of death had a toxicological component that had not been adequately considered initially. It was not just an accident or an unfortunate moment. There were signs of contact with substances that could have accelerated or caused the outcome, a hidden truth within the complexity of those last days. This reopened the door to reconsider actors and motives, not as mere suspects, but as active and aware pieces. What had at first seemed like a closed, routine case ended up being a human mosaic where every fragment revealed deep wounds, and where a tiny trace, barely a lost thread in the fabric of the investigation, was a key that unlocked a hidden truth, a truth that called on us to listen not only with eyes and hands, but with heart and patience, remembering that forensic science is a precise art of giving voice to those who can no longer speak. And so, at that moment, I understood that the trace no one noticed was not simply a vestige. It was the very story of Alberto Marquez, a story woven with fear, courage, and silences that, finally, had begun to speak. That toxicological revelation not only added a new layer of complexity, but also opened a window into the darkest and most concealed fabric of the case. There were moments when I felt the investigation slipping through my fingers, like fine sand that escapes if not held carefully, with patience. It wasn't just about finding culprits, but understanding how that invisible trap, that silent poison, had reached Alberto's hands. A victim perhaps aware of the risk, but trapped without escape, with that fresh knowledge. The inquiry could no longer be limited to the deceased's physical route or his immediate circle of acquaintances. It was necessary to trace back to the very sources of those substances, investigating clandestine laboratories, workshops, and the shadowy interactions forged in the most neglected corners of the neighborhood. That might mean challenging figures who moved stealthily, accustomed to the law and its procedures not reaching them, or being lost in endless bureaucracy. I then remembered the fragility of those environments, where distrust was not only a social barrier, but a shield for self-protection. Every testimony we managed to extract was laden with fear, uncertainty, as if speaking words was opening the floodgate that could release all the pressure built up from years of threats. That atmosphere was also felt within the team, who remained alert, cautious, walking on ground where a wrong word, a misplaced gesture, could trigger unexpected consequences. Days passed, and the night itself seemed to take on a leading role in this story. It was in those late hours, in the solitude and silence of forensic analysis, when patterns began to emerge that had until then escaped us. The stains, chemical traces, snippets of discreetly intercepted conversations, all began to point toward a field where interests and vendettas converged. A mosaic where every piece, no matter how small, took on a new and revealing meaning. Thus, the synthetic garment ceased to be a mere clue, to become a kind of signature linking various actors, from a man with a scar to those shadows moving unrecognized within the community. It was as if that small fabric were impregnated with the fear and resistance of a part of San Telmo that hid not only in alleys but in the skin of its inhabitants, in the very cracks of their daily relationships. On one of those intense days, I received an unexpected call from an older man, known for his discretion and discreet dealings with justice, a veteran shoemaker who had observed almost everything silently for years. His confession came in a whisper, fearful but firm. He claimed that the garment, that emblem that had caused so many turns, belonged to a group that called themselves Los Tejidos, the Weavers, a name that in local jargon had very specific connotations. They were not just a gang of criminals, but a conglomerate functioning almost like a parallel system. They controlled not only trafficking and extortion, but also political and economic ties at unexpected levels. The shoemaker spoke knowingly, with pauses betraying fear, but also conviction. He recounted how that group had imposed a macabre order, an internal code where loyalty was paid in blood and silence was worth more than any word. According to him, Alberto had tried to break that chain, at least in what he controlled. His own small world, his building, his direct relationships. But the resistance left no room for half measures. That story began to take near-epic dimensions. The tragedy of an ordinary man challenging invisible forces and facing a stubborn fate. As I listened, I could imagine those old streets, those gates with rusted bars, the withered and tired faces passing without crossing paths, as if avoiding looking directly at the fear that dwelled within them. Alberto's story was not an isolated chapter. It was a window into a reality where present and past intertwined with threads that hurt, pulsed silently. And there, in that fabric, was a very synthetic garment, small and insignificant to many, yet charged with the memory and shadow of so many. The following days were a race against the clock. On one hand, the need to protect the integrity of neighbors willing to cooperate. On the other, the constant tension of not knowing who watched every move of the team. The arrival of an anonymous package had been only the first sign that someone was willing to risk everything to maintain silence. It was not simply a warning. It was a challenge, an implicit invitation to look further, to delve deeper without fear. That duality, the fear and tenacity, became the rhythm marking our days. The team began working in small groups, with certain procedural precautions to avoid unnecessary exposure. It was then that an unexpected piece fit into the puzzle, the direct link between the missing worker and a network whose tentacles extended beyond the workshop, a circuit where even we, accustomed to seeing the shadows, had not imagined the magnitude or depth of connections. I recall that on several occasions, while analyzing evidence, I had the fleeting sensation that answers arose at the exact moment when silence seemed invincible. That intuition, so important for a forensic expert, accompanied me in deciding to call an old informant, someone with contact inside those circles who, though reluctant, could offer a warning or even a glimpse of understanding. The conversation was not easy. The voice on the other end held that subdued tone of one who knows they speak at risk, but also the need to see change. He clarified that the synthetic garment was not only a symbol of belonging, but also a tool for recognition within a system where trust was sealed through objects and gestures, almost rituals. Each thread, each stain, each small imperfection told a story, a relationship, a debt, or an alliance. It was a silent way of saying, "Here we are, we watch you, and we know what you do." With that information, the case began to take an almost tangible shape, a map that, though dark and winding, could be traversed step by step with caution and resolve. Alberto, in his apparent anonymity and daily routine, had unwittingly entered that system, or perhaps more consciously than we had all thought. His signal was not a shout, but that tiny trace no unsuspecting I would have noticed. That small garment was a key to understanding a network where official justice barely penetrated, a fabric of fear, resistance, and, paradoxically, also solidarity among those who had to survive. The nights in Buenos Aires seemed to hold even deeper secrets as I dove into photos, evidence, and fragmented accounts. Sometimes I felt the city itself became a character, with an unpredictable face capable of hiding the truth beneath its lights and shadows. And there I understood that our challenge was not only forensic but human. To reconstruct the dignity of those who, amid that oppressive system, tried to resist and protect those they loved. That toxicological finding that had rekindled the investigation also taught us something about the fragility and deceptive strength of a body bearing more wounds than those visible. Alberto's death was a silenced outcry, but not impossible to hear. It was a call to remember that not all cases have a clean resolution. Some become entangled in life's complexities and demand we follow them with patience, respect, and above all, courage to lift the veil of indifference. Gradually, as the investigation progressed under that light, I understood that justice must be more than a sentence or a verdict. It must be the voice of those who cannot shout, the hand that gathers what fear wants to bury. And though we do not always solve every mystery, each detail, each trace, brings us a little closer to a plural and human truth, imperfect but necessary. It was in that mingling of hope and fear that I found the final key. Knowing that sometimes a trace nobody noticed not only point a path to truth, but also offers a bridge to the living memory of a community that deserves to be heard. And forensic science, with all its precision, then becomes a deeply human act. The art restoring, through rigor and patience, the voice and story to those left in silence. The days thickened into a tangle of clues and suspicions that seemed endless. Each breakthrough led us to a different dead end. Every answer opened new questions that challenged us not to settle for the obvious. Amid reports, analyses, and careful interviews, I began to feel a kind of exhaustion, not only physical but emotional. That weight we carry when we realize a human story blurs in the cracks of a failed system, where truth is a treasure that is very difficult to obtain and protect. That anonymous package, which at the time felt like a violent act of intimidation, set off a deeper alarm within me. It wasn't just fear. It was a clear sign that we had entered territory unwelcome to those who govern in the shadows. The investigation ceased to be a mere technical exercise. It became a test of nerves and patience. I understood that every contact, every question posed, had to be handled subtly so as not to provoke a chain reaction, something that could endanger everyone, starting with the neighbors who bravely dared to share fragments of truth. I remember one particular day when the rain seemed to fall nonstop over Buenos Aires, and the droplets hit the laboratory windows with a rhythm as relentless as the events we were unraveling. It was then that, studying closely a small fragment of the synthetic garment, I noticed something that at first seemed an insignificant curiosity, but gradually shaped into a key clue. The fabric bore a subtle pattern, a row of threads with a slightly different hue, almost imperceptible. That difference was no accident. It spoke of a very specific manufacturer, a semi-clandestine producer who supplied only certain sectors within the city, the less visible ones, those who move in a world between anonymity and power. From that discovery, the map of contacts and places to investigate expanded considerably. The team and I embarked on a search that led us to dimly lit alleys, workshops hidden behind humble facades, and actors who until then seemed like shadows in the plot. In those encounters, reality showed its harshest face. We spoke with people who avoided direct eye contact and lowered their voices when mentioning Los Tejidos. Yet, those same voices held traces of struggle, remorse, and sometimes restrained anger. They were narratives tattooed with first-hand experiences, where revealing a secret could mean a tacit sentence. One rainy night, while reviewing the recordings and transcripts of those interviews, an unexpected opportunity arose. A reliable messenger arrived at the laboratory, delivering an unmarked package, common in this kind of investigation, but always carrying the unease of mystery. Inside, I found documents, photographs, and a small dossier that seemed prepared for someone with certain knowledge. The images showed faces, places, and objects we had already mentioned, but there were also handwritten notes and diagrams connecting characters who, at least on the surface, seemed unrelated. However, the message was clear. No one was outside that network, and the web was far more extensive and complex than we had imagined. Among those pages, I also found a writing that caught my attention. It was a brief letter and signed, outlining in broad strokes the inner workings of Los Tejidos, with direct mentions of initiation rituals, codes of silence, and relentless punishments for those who dare to break the rules. The tone of the letter was almost solemn, as if the anonymous author wished to bear witness to a truth that weighed heavily, a cry held back in time but ready to be heard. I felt a lump in my throat reading it. I remember that justice is often enforced not only by laws but by the courage of those who choose not to remain silent. Alberto's case reached unimaginable drama. His death was no longer a simple result of an accident or an isolated act. It was a culmination of a cruel chain of events designed to keep intact a system that feeds on human vulnerability. I was overwhelmed by a mixture of sadness and helplessness, but also by an urgent need for his story not to be buried among files. That is why I insisted on every interview, every search, every analysis, despite the warnings and the looming shadow of danger over all of us. That's when the real scope of the network became even clearer. We discovered that, through unofficial methods, significant amounts of chemicals were handled, used not only to produce drugs but also poisons that could be applied discreetly. This revelation brought the focus back to certain individuals who until then had been considered mere witnesses or passive collaborators. Some had connections with local authorities, others with business sectors who, without appearing openly, influenced key neighborhood decisions and ultimately protected this dark current under a veil of impunity. Tension within the team grew. The pressure was not only external. It also showed in our meetings, in the way we began to distrust more and to be more cautious with the information we shared. I especially remember a decisive moment. During a meeting with a trusted informant, a man with a deep voice and tired eyes, we received news of unusual movements in the area. Apparently, someone had tried to access the laboratory where we kept some key evidence. We couldn't know who, but that act made it clear the adversary was aware and watching every step we took. That night, I had trouble sleeping, not just because of the workload, but because of the clear awareness that we were at a point of no return. I couldn't stop thinking about Alberto, that ordinary man whose life had put him face to face with an invisible power that devours without asking, and about the neighborhood people, all those faces had learned to live under the shadow of Los Tejidos, coexisting with fragile social fabric on the verge of breaking. But amid that tension, there were also signs of hope. The team, despite the fatigue, responded with greater commitment, aware of the importance of what we were doing. We began receiving more testimonies, increasingly less timid, and we understood that although fear was still present, there was a genuine desire for justice, a collective need for these stories to be acknowledged, no matter how small. I saw how the community began to join voices, building a shared narrative that challenged the imposed silence. It was during those endless nights of work that I understood that true forensic science is not only practiced with instruments and laboratories. It is a task that requires deep empathy, the skill to read between the lines, and the patience to listen to those invisible whispers that tell more than any expert evidence. The tiny trace I found at the beginning was merely a symbol of something much larger. The invisible pulse of a city fighting its own shadows, a symphony of lives intertwined by pain and resilience. We pressed on slowly, carefully, but without stopping. We knew that every step, however small, brought us closer to a clearer picture of what really happened and of the people behind it all. And although the door to justice seemed reluctant to open, I was convinced, and told the team more than once, that it was not enough to prove guilt. Our task was, ultimately, to offer Alberto and all those affected a tangible truth, something that recognized their dignity and would not let their story dissolve into nothingness. Thus, between the mist that settles in the corners of San Telmo at nightfall and the tireless light of science seeking its path, the story continued to unfold. I knew it would not end that day or the next, but simply having that fragment of fabric before me, that small trace no one had seen, reminded me that sometimes justice is found in the subtlest details, and to reach it, patience is more than a virtue. It is the only guarantee that truth will not be lost to oblivion or the noise of indifference. The weight of every step we took grew more intense as the days passed. What at first seemed like a closed case, ordinary and routine, had transformed into a personal and professional labyrinth that absorbed us completely. The fabric, that small fiber with a peculiar weave, had opened a door to a clandestine universe where nothing was as it seemed and where the truth hid behind invisible layers of fear and silence. With each advance, the complicated mosaic of Los Tejidos became clearer and at the same time more terrifying, as if we were unearthing a story too deep for anyone to want to face. The team and I had decided to move cautiously, but we couldn't help feeling the pressure of an enemy who seemed to anticipate every one of our moves. Sleepless nights became the new normal, with the laboratory lit only by the faint glow of the screen, where we analyzed data that sometimes confused more than clarified. However, it was in those moments of silent frustration when, once again, the invisible trace appeared to guide us. The information gathered in the anonymous dossier led us to discover an unexpected link between a supposed small textile workshop in a marginalized neighborhood and a well-known local businessman, a man with a lot of power but few eyes in his gaze. The revelation shook us more than I expected. At first, it was hard for me to believe that behind seemingly distant spheres there was such a deep connection, but driven by the evidence, we visited that workshop where the clandestine production of garments not only provided employment, but also served as an operations center for much darker activities. There, words were barely spoken, and looks became coded messages. We realized that the same fabric that had changed our course was a tangible link between people moving on the thin line, between legal and illegal. This new edge of the investigation brought an unexpected twist. The list of suspects grew, involving not only marginalized individuals, but also low-ranking police officers, municipal workers, and even members of the local elite. We discovered that some sites we believed abandoned or irrelevant were actually nerve points where chemicals and essential documents were stored to reinforce the criminal network. The danger became more real than ever because we were no longer facing isolated actors, but an organization that had woven its influence by infiltrating structures and authorities. Amid this whirlwind, the neighborhood's atmosphere changed subtly. People noticed something was happening, and whole generations who had learned to remain silent began to share snippets of their truth through whispers and knowing looks. It was thanks to some of these testimonies that we learned of rituals no one would have expected, secret ceremonies carried out by members of Los Tejidos to demonstrate loyalty, with symbols and commitments that went far beyond the ordinary. I remember one particularly intense interview with a woman who had lost a family member and who, after a long time, dared to tell details of how those ceremonies use a mix of fear and a sense of belonging to chain people in a cycle that was almost impossible to break. Her voice trembled, and as she spoke, the expression in her eyes was infinitely deep, a mixture of pain and hope. Those words echoed in me like a reverberation. How many similar stories are hidden in the corners of our city, unexplored and silenced? But the real blow came when we encountered concrete evidence that some within the team itself were under surveillance. The laboratory was a key point, and the attempted unauthorized access made us take extreme measures. Fear was no longer abstract. It was a tangible presence, a shadow that followed each of our steps. This made it both a driving force and a brake. It awakened the urgency to continue, but also the need to protect ourselves. For this reason, the investigation took on a more strategic tone, with defined roles and precautions we had never handled before in similar cases. In that climate of distrust, mixed feelings also arose. Some team members began to question how much it was worth risking, while others clung to their commitment as a lifeline. I myself found myself struggling with the contradiction of wanting justice at all costs and the deep respect I have for the life of everyone who helped us, aware that each person who dared to speak also risked something very personal. As we dug deeper, data began to emerge linking certain characters with episodes of corruption documented years earlier, all following a similar pattern: mutual protection under the shadow of impunity. It was as if we had found a canvas painted with the same colors for decades, but for various reasons, no one had the courage or the opportunity to uncover it. The tide seemed to swell, and we were only small links in a much longer and more complex chain. One night, a recorded conversation from an informant caught my attention. They spoke of names that until then were just margin notes in our files, and that now took concrete shape. Men and women who seemed to pull invisible strings of power, willing to do anything to protect their interests. I sat in the laboratory, the recording on loop, listening to every word and pondering the implications. It was at that moment I understood that our fight was not only against a law of silence and fear, but against a network sustained by widespread indifference and complicity disguised as normality. But despite the weight of that reality, we never lost sight that at the center of it all was Alberto, with his story cut so abruptly and the dignity he deserved to rebuild. It was that awareness that sustained us, because even if the pieces seemed arranged to protect the powerful, our task was to expose them. This certainty made us continue despite fatigue, the invisible wounds each of us carried, and the sleepless nights when everything seemed to crumble. And we did it step by step, piece by piece, consolidating a solid narrative that at times seemed too vast to fit in bureaucratic files. I particularly recall one night when, after long hours, the laboratory was only lit by a lamp, the absolute silence as witness. I was reviewing a folder when I felt everything make sense. The connections, the patterns, the names, every little thread fragment of that garment. The trace I had noticed at the beginning now seemed a tangible symbol not only of a crime, but of the invisible network that oppresses so many communities. It was a moment of clarity, combined with the bitter certainty of the struggle ahead. In recent days, as the case progressed, external pressure increased. Anonymous calls and suspicious movements reinforced the threat, but the internal voices grew stronger. The community began to organize, to express that need for recognition and justice that had been silenced for so long. I saw in the faces of those who dared to speak a mixture of fear, courage, and relief. It was a confirmation that a story, no matter how complex and painful, can become strength when shared. From that modest trace, we managed not only to reconstruct the journey of Garment, but also to unravel a much deeper plot. Los Tejidos ceased to be a shadow and became a visible enemy, defeatable if worked on with patience, intelligence, and humanity. And although the story would not end that day, nor the next, nor perhaps for a long time, I felt that we had achieved something that transcends reports. Opening a breach in a wall of silence, now beginning to show the light of truth. The memory of Alberto, his story cut so abruptly, became our beacon. His face, invisible to many, must forever be the emblem of the right to real justice, not administrative or abstract, but sincere and tangible. From that laboratory, with the murmur of the city and the rain hitting the windows, I understood that justice is a slow and arduous path, but that if traveled to the end with the patience that minimal traces demand and attentive listening, the truth will emerge, not as a mere conclusion, but as an act of dignity for those who can no longer tell it. Today, looking back, and despite all hardships, I feel that small trace nobody had noticed was a key to beginning to weave a new story, one worth telling, and that, I hope, inspires not only those of us who work in justice, but an entire community that deserves to be heard and remembered. Because sometimes truth doesn't appear in shouts, but in whispers that only have to wait for the right moment to become a hurricane. And although that rainy night seemed endless later under the faint crack of light, we discovered that among those small signs hides the indomitable force that drives the world forward. That night, after assembling every piece of evidence with the patience that only experience can give, I felt we were reaching a crucial point. The small footprint, invisible to so many eyes, had just shown us the way, the heartbeat that would guide the core of the entire investigation. We knew that what we were facing was not just a criminal network, but a labyrinth woven with invisible threads that ran through society like a silent poison. It was then that I understood that no matter how worn out we were, what mattered was the strength that could rise when the truth, the minimal but constant truth, began to make its way through. Once the clandestine workshop was identified, the entrances and exits ceased to be rumors and turned into questions that demanded immediate answers. The pressure was unbearable. Amid those tensions, we lived scenes that seemed taken from movies but were in fact a harsh Argentine reality. Chases in narrow alleys, furtive meetings in deserted squares, and a constant game of shadows between police and them, the Weavers. Every step we took brought us closer to a new dead end, but also to small silent victories, like the testimony that revealed the secret ceremonies and their function as a kind of dark belonging ritual. I remember thinking again, with some anguish but also some admiration, about what forensic science can do. It's not just about evidence, analysis, or lab tests. The real power lies in digging into people's memories, listening to every sigh, capturing the fear and hope hidden behind their words. The woman with tear-filled eyes didn't just give us information. She gave us an impossible-to-ignore piece, the key to understanding how such a network survives by feeding on fear and silence. Each day was tinted with a dense gray. There were moments when exhaustion seemed like an abyss easy to fall into. The threats, implicit and explicit, grew. False friends were revealed, and some teams hesitated. But it was in that weariness that the invisible footprint, the trace of that particular fabric, appeared like a sacred sign reminding us what we were fighting for. We were not just a group of investigators. We were the eyes, the hands, and the voice of those who could not expose themselves. Every piece fitted, every name found, was an act of covert justice. The scale of the network was greater than we had imagined. Connections with corrupt police officers, officials who should protect but became accomplices, municipal workers involved, and a local elite that would never have been suspected. It was an intricate web, woven with patience and calculated impunity. That's why every advance was double-edged. It brought us closer to the truth, but also made us targets. The laboratory became a refuge and a trench, its lights flickering on and off, its doors armored not only to preserve evidence, but protect those of us who stayed on the front line. I felt an unprecedented weight when we learned that some of our own were being watched, that the enemy was not only outside but infiltrated, lurking in the darkness. Paranoia seeped into even the simplest actions, forcing us to make strategic decisions. Clandestine meetings in sparsely frequented cafes, coded passwords to exchange information, comings and goings in cars disguised as ordinary to avoid attention. Each day that passed, I understood this fight was not just that of an isolated team, but of an entire community battling dirty forces to reclaim dignity. It was inevitable that this situation would test our convictions. Some succumbed to fear and withdrew. Others held on more tightly than ever, like a beacon in the storm. I myself felt the conflict, justice, that ideal that guided my career, confronted with the fragile reality of human life. Every testimony collected, every note taken, came at a personal cost. I saw in my companion's eyes a mix of fatigue and determination, and in mine, resignation tinged with minimal but real hope. As we connected all the dots, we began to see a pattern that had repeated for years, perhaps decades, protected by a network of complicity that had prevented justice from arriving sooner. It was as if that criminal web was a painting made with the same colors, a painting hung before us that no one had dared to take down. Alberto's story ceased to be an isolated tragedy and became part of a great spiderweb that made us aware of the scope, the real size of what we were about to uncover. The recording that came into our hands was one of those moments that mark before and after. Hearing voices, names, plans, without knowing who could be listening or who might hear through those invisible walls, was an experience I will never forget. It was more than an audio. It was tangible proof that the network protected itself with refined care, ready to attack, ready to silence. That revelation made us rethink almost everything. What we had considered a sequence of isolated events was in reality a meticulously organized system. And yet, beneath all that dark web was Alberto. His face in my thoughts became a beacon I could not extinguish. His indignity, the violence that ended his life, demanded that at least we manage to unravel the truth, that once it burst into the light, it would serve for more than feeding files and statistics. Remembering that behind the case there was a real person and a legacy to honor was what sustained us through those endless months. That night in the laboratory, when the doors closed and silence enveloped everything, something happened that still moves me when I remember it. Amid folders, documents, and new evidence, an image formed that until then had been blurry. I saw, with total clarity, how each thread of that fabric, every insignificant fragment, was actually a map of power and control. In that moment, I understood we were at a turning point. The footprint no one had seen at first was now a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest evidence can change the course of a story. The days that followed were marked by a mixture of progress and tension. Anonymous calls increased, veiled messages, even strange movements around our homes. But the voices within the community grew too, those that had long remained silent and now, with every testimony, began to gain strength. I saw how glances crossed in the streets, how words began to circulate despite the fear. It was a new pulse, an underground current of collective that gave meaning to all the effort. What began with a simple footprint became a chain of events capable of exposing a complex and dangerous network. The weavers emerged from the shadows and presented themselves as what they were, a visible enemy, vulnerable if dealt with intelligence and truth as a banner. I understood the investigation was not only a technical process, but an act of humanity. We opened a breach in the wall of silence that for so long had protected impunity. It was not the end yet, not even a definitive chapter, but the beginning of something new. The memory of Alberto never disappeared from my mind. His figure stood as the emblem of the justice we sought. True, sincere, palpable. From that corner in the laboratory, with the rain pounding the windows, I understood that justice is an endless, slow, and painful struggle that demands almost religious patience. But I also understood that the minimal footprints, the ones no one notices at first, are the ones that finally reveal the deepest truth. Dignity is defended not only in courtrooms, but also in the everyday gestures of those who dare to listen, to keep searching, to never give up. Now, looking back, and without pretending the story's over, I feel a mix of sadness and hope. The small footprint that at first went unnoticed was the start of weaving a narrative of resistance and courage. I hope the story speaks not only to those of us who work in justice, but to the entire community that deserves to be heard, remembered, and defended. Because sometimes truth is not declared with loud noises, but with whispers chosen by the right time that, when they come, become a hurricane capable of moving mountains. And though that rainy night seemed endless later, under that dim light, we discovered that in those small signs lies the indomitable strength that drives the world forward, unstoppable and authentic. The days that followed that crucial moment in the laboratory were tinged with palpable, almost unbearable tension, but also with a strange calm that seemed to precede the storm. Every location, every person linked to the case, became a stage where truth and danger danced an unsettling dance. We walked on shifting ground, aware that a wrong step could mean the loss of the entire structure built with so much effort. However, we were also aware that standing still was not an option. Silence, in this context, equated to complicity or death. One night, while reviewing documents with my colleagues, we received a call that altered the course of events. The voice on the other end, trembling and urgent, belonged to a former member of the network, someone who for years had lived trapped by fear and forced loyalties. His words were a mix of confusion, contained rage, and finally, a glimpse of hope. He revealed details we had never expected, hidden connections that extended not only to Buenos Aires, but to other provinces and even borders. It was a missing piece in a puzzle whose outline had been slowly taking shape, but that also brought an immediate and violent response from those who felt cornered. Soon, the intimidation stopped being anonymous messages and turned into concrete acts. A vehicle set on fire in front of one of the investigators' homes, the temporary disappearance of some crucial evidence from the laboratory, and calls with explicit threats were just part of an escalation that seemed designed to break us morally. In the midst of that climate, I understood how heavy the decision to continue was. Every step toward the truth was also a step into the unknown, not only for us but for our families and for those holding on to the ideal of justice. I clearly remember that early morning when an urgent call ripped me from my sleep. "Andres, we have to move quickly. They've just located the key witness. He's in danger." I heard clearly. Time became an enemy running against us, and yet every move had to be calculated, like a game of chess where the stakes were much more than a match. It was life itself. It was the first time I felt fully aware of the real cost of this investigation, and at the same time of the close possibility of changing the course that impunity had imposed for years. Shortly after, under intermittent rain, and with pounding hearts, we witnessed the operation to rescue a man who had decided to break the silence. The tension was palpable. Fear and hope painted a contradictory landscape on every face. The trace that had initially gone unnoticed, that small sign now resonated louder than ever. It was living proof that those who doubted the patient in detailed reconstruction now had to recognize that justice, although slow and sometimes painful, marched inexorably forward. From that operation onward, things happened that, on the surface, contradicted expectations. The network began to show cracks, its members started to doubt, and unexpected movement arose in the community. People who had previously stayed in the shadows, out of fear or indifference, began to raise their voices. Anonymous testimonies, small stagger complaints that seemed harmless but accumulated, represented a threat to the hidden power structure. It was a silent awakening, almost invisible but unstoppable, like an underground current eroding the solid rock of fear. What at first seemed like a technical investigation focused on forensic evidence turned into something much more complex. We were wrapped in a cultural, social, and political battle. Science alone was no longer enough. We needed the strength of collective commitment. Those days, amid reports, clandestine meetings, and watch walks, I understood that the trace I had found, the one others had ignored, not only marked a place or a time, but represented a form of resistance that, no matter how small it seemed, could upheave seemingly unbreakable systems. But the network reacted. With brutal cynicism, names of trusted people began to appear, of colleagues, even officers seemingly spotless at first glance. The mask game became inevitable. It was not uncommon for a friendly smile to hide a traitor willing to sell any hope out of convenience or fear. It was a time when I learned that in the fight for justice, one faces not only external forces, but also internal doubts, personal weariness, the battle within oneself not to lose faith amid so much darkness. I recall a specific night, sitting alone in the laboratory, surrounded by papers and staring at that trace. I thought of Alberto, of his face, of his truncated story. I thought of all those who, like him, had fallen under the shadow of those Tejidos, their invisible hands spreading like spider webs throughout the city. It was then that I had a certainty. This fight should not only be told, but lived by those who truly understand that within every tiny detail, even in an almost imperceptible groove, lies the power to transform realities. When justice began to act, with search warrants, arrests, and confiscations of assets, I felt a mix of relief and unease, because I knew that every step forward also represented a dangerous setback, a strategic retreat by an enemy not willing to surrender without fighting. The streets filled with rumors, neighborhoods divided, and some allies showed caution that only comes from knowing the real risk. The narrative was changing, and with it, a new social expectation that a different destiny was possible. At those moments, while the sound of rain kept pounding the laboratory windows, I knew the work was far from over. This story, our story, was a constant reminder that truth can be fragile, almost invisible like that trace no one noticed, but also that, When upheld by the strength of will and humanity, that truth becomes a light that can pierce the deepest darkness. That lesson, as valuable as any scientific finding, is what I want to share with you today. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: how many traces go unseen? How many minimal truths hide in forgotten corners, waiting for someone who, like me, decides to look at them with the calm and patience they deserve? Because sometimes justice does not shout, does not break in, but whispers. And when those small voices, those imperceptible signs begin to speak, the world changes, even if no one at that moment fully understands it. So, as I close this chapter of my life in this investigation, I leave you with this powerful idea. The strength of truth lies not in the obvious, but in the invisible, in that which no one noticed until someone decided to see. And in that act of seeing, of searching carefully and without rush, lies the true hope of justice. This does not end here, because the trace that led to discovering Los Tejidos is just one of many waiting to be found. And as long as there are those brave enough to look, listen, and act, there will be a future. Because in the end, the truth that unites lives and destinies, always finds its way to the light.